Perfect. So as everyone sort of joins us, good afternoon, bonjour. Welcome to part one of our diversity and inclusion webinar for Historic Places Open to the Public. This webinar will be recorded. My name is Kirsten Vermacke, and I'm a project manager with the National Trust for Canada. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a settler and guest on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We recognize that our webinar participants live and work on the lands and territories of many Indigenous peoples across Canada, and we encourage you to reflect on the shared human experience of storytelling as placemaking and community building. It is through storytelling that we can learn from one another and create richer and more accurate stories of all of the places that are important to us. So welcome. Let me just take a moment and I'll tell you a little bit more about the National Trust for Canada before we get started. Next slide, please. The National Trust is Canada's national charitable not-for-profit organization that leads and inspires action for places that matter. We have a long track record of heritage conservation and working with communities to save and renew historic places. At the National Trust, we are on a mission to bring heritage to life in more ways than one. We get people excited about places that matter, places that connect us to our roots and improve quality of life. We provide tools to save and renew historic places like Regeneration Works and a treasure trove of destinations to visit and discover. You can find us at our website or on all of our different social media channels here on the slide. Next slide, please. For today's webinar, I'd like to welcome Karen Carter, the president and founder of Karen Carter and Associates Cultural Consulting. She is the former executive director of Heritage Toronto, the founding executive director of Museum of Toronto, and co-founder of Black Artists Network and Dialogue, an organization dedicated to the promotion of Black arts and culture in Canada and abroad. Karen's most recent project is as co-founder of the BIPOC Fellowship to help support the development of a more diverse cultural landscape in Canada. We are fortunate to have Karen with us today, leading the discussion on diversity and inclusion in historic places. Thank you, Karen. This webinar series will be available as part of our Diversity and Inclusion in Historic Places Resource Kit for Historic Places Days 2023, and is made possible with support from the Department of Canadian Heritage. I'll give a brief overview of the Trust's Historic Places Day program, as well as an introduction to our efforts so far in promoting diversity and inclusion in historic places open to the public. Karen will then take over and share her presentation on building community. We will leave your questions until the end of the webinar, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature to log questions at any point of the presentation that we will address afterwards. Vous pouvez poser des questions en français aussi. And next slide, please. If you're new to Historic Places Days, in brief, it is a national multi-day event in July, and it's designed to shine a spotlight on historic places from coast to coast to coast. Historic Places Days is really a platform. It's an opportunity to gain profile and visitors. It exists as much online as it does in person and on the ground. The Trust is happy to be the lead partner to make Historic Places Days happen. We appreciate greatly the participation and support of Parks Canada and close to 600 participating historic sites across the country. For Historic Places Days 2022, a little bit of information is on the screen now, including our reach of just over 2.4 million Canadians reached during the month of July. We had over 579 historic sites registered and gave away just over $12,000 worth of prizes to our participants. And there were over 170 virtual and in-person events during the program. This past year, the Trust took a particular interest in creating more diverse content and building intentional relationships. The strategy was to take a regional focus and partner with organizations and individuals doing work on telling fuller, more diverse stories. A significant challenge to diversity is that built heritage generally remains for many, at its essence, a colonial project. As such, 2022 was an opportunity to reconsider and grow understanding of where the conversation about historic sites and built heritage fits into the larger work of inclusion, accessibility, decolonization, and reconciliation. We know that there are many stories that have been ignored and erased, and that communities across the country lack the resources or the support to fully share their history. Next slide, please. With a specific goal to tell more diverse stories and include more equity-seeking groups, the Trust reached out to established partners across Canada to develop connections with historic places that tell underrepresented stories. Funding was offered to community groups to encourage sites to create a listing on the website, share their on-site events, and curate content and visit lists like the ones that you see here on the screen. Heritage leaders in historic places are increasingly recognizing the imperative to build relationships, reach new audiences, and make space for narratives that tell a more inclusive story of Canada. It can be difficult to know where to start this process, and so this series of webinars will introduce these concepts and address some of the unique challenges that historic places face in Canada. These webinars will offer an informed exploration of diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in historic places, and equip participants to transform your storytelling moving forward with confidence. We will identify potential barriers to more inclusive ways of storytelling and provide opportunities for intercultural knowledge sharing and exchange to identify best practices in telling more diverse stories and build community. As registrants for today's webinar, you will be invited to the next two parts of the series taking place in the new year, and this webinar will be recorded and shared afterwards. Next slide, please, Holly. So with that introduction, I'd like to pass it over to Karen Carter for the content of today's webinar, Building Communities. Karen?
Hi there. I started talking and forgot that I'd muted myself. What's happening? Thanks to the Trust for the opportunity to speak with folks. Just a quick addition that as a woman of African descent, whose people are in these parts according to both force and choice of migration. Mine, forced migration, I'm descendants of folks who are connected to the transatlantic slave trade in the Caribbean. There's an extra responsibility, I think, on my part to be an ally and a co-conspirator in the fight for Indigenous rights and social justice in this country and in this land. I wanted to just begin by saying that this is there's an awareness, I think, on the Trust part and definitely on my part that this work is ongoing. So the opportunity that Historic Places Days provides is hopefully an opportunity for people to poke their feet in waters that they may not be fully comfortable with, but that's part of the process. So please don't feel like you can't try something because trying is part of the process, and entering this work with grace for yourself and for the people in the community who may not be sympathetic to that you're not fully at the place where you're necessarily comfortable in understanding how to deal with the dynamics of telling other people's stories, because this industry, frankly, has been built in a very specific way. And so the work to unlearn the things that many of us have learned is that it's work. And so we got to begin somewhere. With that said, I'm going to begin with the first slide, which is who are your audiences and how do you prepare for programming with the diversity, equity, access, and inclusion lens in mind. I think, especially for those that are hosting on physical spaces, there's some really practical ways that you can begin to ascertain who your audiences may be for Historic Places Days. And the most practical part of that is just who are your current audiences. If you're engaging online or if you're engaging in person, actually taking the time to have a meeting with volunteers, if you're lucky enough to have staff, because again, we know that the plethora of historic sites and folks that are involved in this type of heritage work across the country is often led by a lot of volunteers, people giving of their time and energies because they're interested in and passionate about this work. But taking the time, however it is that you do, to just more purposefully look at who are our current audiences and how might this project of Historic Places Days open us up to new audiences. And if you start to look at what those new audiences may look like, it will help direct what type of programming you may choose to build around that audience. So the first phase of work is really about who are we and how are we hoping to interact with the people that we would host either physically or virtually through our programming. And if you have a sense of who your audience is, maybe, then you will start to determine how you may approach these type of equity work. So for instance, there are two lanes around equity work, one being just a good experience for people to feel a sense of place and presence in the experience they're having. Like it or not, this is entertainment for a lot of people. They go out looking to be educated, but also to enjoy themselves and to have a good time and to learn something, to feel that it's something that's family friendly. So you're thinking maybe about families, parents with kids or grandparents with grandkids. And all those dynamics make you think about what you deliver, but also how these folks who are coming to engage in your programming, your storytelling, your online platforms in a way that makes it feel like safe space. And that's the core of it. If you assess a sense of who your audience might be, how are you ensuring that you're developing an experience that will be safe space for them? Next slide. So one of the easiest things is just the awareness of queer identified, trans identified peoples. And so one of the things that I wanted to think about is, if you are in physical space, how may you look at signage that is more welcoming to visitors? So something as simple as a washroom that has a sign like this, which is allowing for people across the gender spectrum, whether they identify as male, female, trans, queer, this physical identifier just automatically gives a sense of safety. I'm going to talk a bit later about what to do if there's pushback, if you're in a particular community and people are used to you operating in a particular way and they're frankly not ready for the change that the organization is doing. Those of us who followed the news around the Human Rights Museum know that some of the issues that they were dealing with was them trying to do this work around human rights and having front desk staff get pushback from visitors, and how to allow for the visitors. You can't control what they're going to do, but you have to protect your volunteers and your staff, and to allow a safe space for them to be able to be on this journey with you, and to be able to hopefully pull in opportunities for signage and other information that make people feel safe, but to also be able to make sure the staff, which is why I say you start internally with a discussion with volunteers and the team that's going to be a part of this process, whether it's online or in person, to ensure that they feel that this is a process you're going through together, and that they're not going to be, frankly, feel like they're left to hang out to dry if the public doesn't respond. I think sometimes we think everyone in the world is ready for diversity, equity work. Everyone isn't. And the honesty of just knowing that will save us a lot of pain, or prepare us, frankly, for some of the pain, and help to protect the team that we're working with. So look in your space and think about physical considerations, or look online and think about, are there opportunities for you to include things that would allow for sign language? Do you have the funds for that? Is there opportunities to secure grants for that? If you are doing something that's recorded, is there an opportunity to make sure that, especially if there's language barriers, that you just have the written version of the audio file, which would help with those that are hearing impaired? So think just about all the different ways that whatever you're doing could become more open and accessible. And also, how can you reach out to community partners to help with that accessibility? Because sometimes we reach out and you should already, I would hope, be doing introductions, getting to know people, not going to them for the first time to ask for a favor. But if you've built those relationships, this type of a public project is a way that people get the benefit of working with you, because you would obviously announce them as a partner or collaborator in the initiative. And it's a really practical way that those of us who are from racialized and more diverse communities can come to projects with partnerships that feel really robust and legitimate as a way to work together. Next slide. So from the first greeting to departure, which is about who is your first person, or how is the audiences that are coming, again, online or offline, in person, how is that greeting happening? So if someone is coming and signing into a webinar, as you saw today, like, is there a land acknowledgement, and is that land acknowledging where the person is at, but also acknowledging that in a being virtual, you could have a global, or at least in our case, a national audience. So I think the way the trust introduced this talk as a model, and as stated, this is going to be recorded, so you may just want to use some of the language that we've seen Christian use in introducing the talk today. So it's that, the greeting part, and is it who's physically greeting someone? I think a lot of us know that a lot of these historic places are places where you walk in and maybe sometimes someone's dressed in period dress. And the notion of costuming when it comes to cultural dress is a charged and difficult and frankly dangerous lane to play in. So maybe think about, instead of that person being in period attire, maybe you have the person just in regular attire, and maybe the attire is on a mannequin. And it's an opportunity as people come in to talk about what, the textiles, or who made the outfit, or why someone would be wearing a particular type of garment or fabric, or whatever other piece that is a part of the outfit that in another day would have been worn as cultural, quote unquote, or period costume. But when you're talking about clothing that's a part of someone's cultural heritage, the word costume frankly becomes dangerous and offensive. So to sit this, again, a lot of what you're going to hear me saying is going to sound like I'm repeating the same thing, but it's bring the staff and the volunteers together, sit down and literally walk through who is our audiences. And then from the time these people arrive to the time they depart, what is the experience that we want them to have? Apologies, I'm battling a cold, so hopefully this cough will stay away for the rest of this hour. I've kept the image of single occupancy, all gender restroom, just to show you another example around welcoming people and some of the physical markers. I believe we will have these available at the end of the series, so you can just download, print things, and maybe use them where it makes sense in your spaces. The departure piece is also a key one, which is how to get feedback from folks, how to figure out how to stay in touch in robust ways. You may find that you want to isolate this list, that if you get a different audience for Historic Places Days, you may literally just keep that list separate and think about how you may engage with them, how you might follow up with a questionnaire, just to get a sense of why they came, what they were looking for. Did they find the programming effective or educational, enjoyable? Would they come back? So think about, as people leave, how might you collect email addresses and so forth to actually follow up with them? Because often these special projects get you a different audience, and the ability to follow up with them helps to stay connected, but also just helps you to get a sense of, like, were these tourists that were in town for a short period, and so you may not see them again because they're not local, or are they local people who were driven to come out because of the national energy around Historic Places Days? Next slide. The key piece around interpretation and interactive experiences is a really important one, because often this is where things like doing things in the kitchen where you're baking goods, or creating something that could be a takeaway for a family and kids. I think you have to, again, look at what you're doing with a more intensive eye, and look at where, especially when it comes to the interactive piece, is there an opportunity to bring in a particular person from a cultural community that may actually give a different perspective around your space? So think about, what if you are located in a particular region and that history is connected to Indigenous cultures? Like, is there an opportunity now for you to pull in someone from the Indigenous community for that program to give that extra level of authenticity? And it may be that you know what to do and how to do it, but you're not from that racial group. And so why not look at that cultural legitimacy that comes from actually asking someone from the cultural group? Same thing with Black or Irish, because sometimes we think that it isn't valid, but it is valid to also look at waves of European migrants who came here under difficult circumstances. I think a lot of Canadians know the history of the Irish famine impacting this country and the way it was built. So is there an opportunity to maybe pull some of that in as well? And that sometimes, if your audience isn't quite there for bringing in Black, Indigenous, and other visually racialized communities, just think about diversity of culture as a way to begin the process. You frankly have to meet people sometimes where they're at. So don't feel like diversity has to be visibly racially diverse. It can also just start with culturally diverse and work your way toward, especially if you don't have those communities present. And the last thing I'll say here is there's also opportunities for just thinking about different programming in the space that isn't necessarily related to the space's history, but is an opportunity for you to welcome different audiences. So, bring in South Asian or African Canadian folks that may not be literally relevant to the site, but you may find that there are historic connections due to our British Commonwealth history. One of the things that I remember learning, which has always influenced my choices in the way that I do things in museum and heritage realms in my career, is in early days, I was at the City of Toronto, and the city's collection, when we built this project called the Toronto Museum Project, was dispersed across different communities. And we took photos of images that were of the works that was in the collection, distributed it to communities, and asked them to give us feedback, tell us what they thought. Didn't ask that they knew the historic reference for the piece, just said, take a look, tell us what comes to mind when you see this item, this object. And it was fascinating because what became clear was a lot of those objects are historic markers for different people around the world because of the influence of the British colonial threads that are global. British were everywhere, right? And so a teapot that just looks like an English silver teapot that may have been more connected for some to a fancy Downton Abbey type of home was also a teapot that was used for brewing coffee in a Egyptian woman's home when she was going to university, studying Sharia law. So think about how that globalness of British Commonwealth history may also allow you to pull in newer immigrants who have an opportunity to comment on things based on their cultural experiences from away. Think about how you can be interactive and how interactive may allow you to just be more flexible. Next slide. What do you want your visitors to take away? I mean, this is one of those things where we, as I said, I mentioned following up with them to collect emails and to get feedback. But at the close of the day, you may just be happy that people came and you're not thinking about exactly what they want to take away. You just want them to come, you want them to have a good experience, and you want them to be able to recommend that they should come back. And that might be the takeaway. So don't put too much pressure on yourself. Sometimes it's like, oh, we have to make a thing and they have to take away a thing, or they have to have something that they could take away and follow up with at home. Sometimes it's okay to just have a visit, people have a good time and they leave. So don't make the visitor takeaway too much pressure, especially if you're trying to manage safe space that feels equitable, feels open to conversations, that feels open to challenging some of the historic threads that you may currently be rooted in. Don't, and I know it sounds like I'm going to say you have to give a takeaway, but I'm in the reverse. I'm in the, it's okay to not have a takeaway in the early stages, because the takeaway means, frankly, usually a lot more work. So most people think, what are we printing? What's the maker space outcome that they can take with them? What's the just the tangible thing that you would take? And sometimes the intangible of just the memory of gathering with people in a safe environment to experience cultural history, that's a takeaway, and that's enough. Next slide. Bringing other stories. And as I said, I'm hoping that if you're sitting, I get 90 of you, 2 of you are, I trust people I know. Let's say maybe there's 5 of you that trust people. So let's say of the 85 of you on this call who are out in the community at different historic sites, working, volunteering in some capacity. hopefully that you've already started this work. You're already trying to reach out to community people. You're already trying to think about how to bring in diverse stories. And that literally means either working with people to develop the storytelling in a way that is accurate, inclusive, respectful of the different cultures, different cultural groups you're engaging with, or them actually doing it themselves. Because sometimes we've seen other folks being sanctioned to do this work and to talk about it, and they spend a lot of time acknowledging that they are a different vessel for communicating something important, that it's not their story, but it's an opportunity for them to share a story. And you give some context and background on how you came to that place by working with a particular cultural community group. I think a lot of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized groups, especially Black and Indigenous groups in this country, because of the role they both played in making Canada, like it or not, the transatlantic slave trade fueled British Commonwealth, which allowed for the wealth that fueled a lot of where and how the Americas were developed. And we would not be here, many of us, if not for that same colonial thread that took over Indigenous land. So when you take land from people and you take labor for free, you're able to build what we see today, which is frankly the spoils of modern day capitalism. And all of that awareness allows us to think really differently about acknowledging these things as we go about storytelling for foundational groups that are a part of this country before it became a country. So I would say, if you have not, then be even more careful about what you do for Historic Places Days coming next year. And I think if you start now, there's time as you jump into January, start to look at who you'd want to partner with, who you might talk to, introduce yourselves and say, you know, we're thinking. Don't come with an ask right away, because people then just feel used, but say we're thinking about how we might be able to work with each other. Let's keep in touch, have a chat, and see what's possible. And if you're lucky, they'll come back to you first before you go back to them. But do think about how to bring stories and different voices in, either because you've been legitimized, because they've sanctioned you to do something that is about them and they're comfortable with that, and you can literally say and introduce that to folks, or because you've brought these different community voices in to participate at a partnership level and a collaborative level on the programming. Next slide. This is where we come into the pushback, because as I said, sometimes we think everyone's ready. Everyone's not ready for diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. And sometimes that's a thing we don't want to say. It's the hidden kind of elephant in the room, or maybe not so hidden, but the elephant in the room. But this photo, and if you go down to the next slide, this photo around, and this is about momentum, but it's the image could have been reversed. You'll go back for me. Were photos that I sourced based on, as I said, knowledge of in my own career, working in places like Canadian Heritage, where there was a quiet room, and the room was there for people who wanted silent meditation or prayer time. So a lot of people, as we know, who are Muslim are praying different times of the day, and so that they could basically have their prayer rugs, go into the room, pray, and then come back to work. But it also was useful for, you know, new moms who just come back to work and were checking on kids. If there was something, if you're a caregiver with elderly parents, I'm in that stage now in my 50s where friends and my parents are not there yet, but you just know things come up as you're dealing with elders in your life. So all of the really just human, personal things that we're often told you can bring your whole self to work or to volunteer work, but there aren't places for you to have these personal moments so that you could get work done and still deal with a personal issue. And so these spaces also become super useful for the challenges that may come from the public. So one of the things that I had a discussion with the former CEO at the Human Rights Museum that I had recommended was create a safe space, especially for the larger museums and heritage spaces. Is there a room that could become a flex room, or a room that could just have a corner in it, whereas you see here, you just get a rug, a simple lamp, And maybe that's all you need. Sometimes you can put other things, a bench, a chair. If you're lucky enough to be able, get a maybe cheap IKEA couch, just something for people to have a quiet space. And if you cannot isolate one room, then is there the opportunity for that to just be take a walk? So physically walk away, take a break, and then come back. And the awareness of that being built into your work as an organization, especially as you get on this diversity, equity, access, and inclusion train, and you know that as a team internally, you might be ready and you're feeling good about the work you're doing. The community partners that are supporting you are there. Things are going tickety-boo, but you know that there are people in the community who may arrive, or frankly, tourists who may arrive that you don't know from Adam, who come with venom and unfriendly and toxic replies, questions and responses that the frontline staff, volunteers are having to deal with. And we know that we can't get into, a full-on argument with these visitors. We know it's not appropriate. So you end up physically having to take the hit, even if it's just to listen and say, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that, or that's your opinion, but this is the work we're doing and we stand by it. And you try to quell things, but you've still taken that hit. That person's taken that hit. And how do you protect your team as they're doing this work in the face of not everyone being ready and not everyone being there? And we know that things like the way the far right's been emboldened through the Trump era means we're seeing more of this toxicity just showing up globally in all over the place. It shows up here in different ways. So let's just not be naive or oblivious to the need to protect the team. And again, it's probably sounding like a broken record, but this started with meet with the team, plan with the team, bring the team along with you, because to do this work effectively, it should permeate the entire organization. And big institutions that are having problems around this diversity work are actually mostly suffering because they're not pulling in the whole team. They're not pulling everybody into the conversation. A few people are doing it. They have a diversity person, and that person is sitting in HR and frankly protecting things more than they're open for change. So a lot of hypocrisy comes when we don't come to this work aware of the fact that not everyone's in the same place, not everybody's going to be there all at the same time. That's just a reality check. But how do you do this work to make sure that you pull people in from where they're at and still protect the folks who are doing this work and are doing it from their heart and may make missteps? So it's like, how do you deal with the missteps? And that's why the word grace has become a very high part of my vocabulary. My mother always says, you only owe people grace. You get up and you give it to get it. So how do you forgive the people who won't forgive you for your misstep, but also protect your team so that they don't feel afraid to do this work? Next slide. So I think this is my last one around building momentum. Am I right, or is there one more? Is there one more? No, I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, back to building momentum. So this is partly about follow-up, but it's also partly about stopping to internally assess. So I mentioned the following up with the visitors, because I do think things like Historic Places Days, it's like, and maybe though people think I'm stretching, but big things like Caravana, TIFF, like things that just bring bigger audiences to things, and thus people who may not necessarily go, doors open, they come then, right? And so doing that follow-up, collecting contact and sending emails and just almost isolating that email list so you have a sense of who those people are, especially if you start to see them only showing up at those things, it's super important. But again, more importantly is, as an organization, do a debrief. Often you do this stuff and you're like, oh my gosh, we survived that. Good, great. And then you're running to the next thing. This diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work is slow molasses work. Slow down. Don't be afraid to slow down. Stop, take a good look, and don't be afraid to assess and then determine what the next step is. So, and again, to have the whole team involved in that, have a debrief, have a bit of a mini town hall with the group, and just get feedback from people to get a sense of what is the best next step, what did they learn from it, and how, frankly, can you pull some of the things you might have done just through Historic Places Days into your day-to-day organizational operations. Because that's the goal here, is that you get to a point where this isn't a stretch. You've recalibrated the way you function, and this work is not, it just becomes a regular part of your DNA. And you're not nervous because Historic Places Days may bring you bigger audience or more attention, because it's just a part of the way the organization functions. That's it for me. Should we take some questions? I purposely tried to talk through because I'm not good at the didactic dump, so I was feeling bad. I was kept looking at the chat, wanting to answer a question. So I'll let you moderate, Christian, and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Karen. I think that was it. I think it's important. I'm glad you reiterated that this work is ongoing, that there isn't a single solution. There isn't one answer to sort of how to solve diversity and equity in your organization. And as the questions sort of come in, also, I think your point about the imperial Commonwealth heritage that we share, I think that's really interesting. We've spoken about that a couple of times, you and I, and realizing that is not homogenous. And this is my cat; she's joining us as well. That idea of immigrant history and settler history, it isn't homogenous, and you don't need to reach too far back in history to find out where your community is, where they came from, and who the people are that live and want to use your heritage space. So I think that was a really interesting point to make, to looking at shared Commonwealth and imperial history. Was fantastic. Thank you, Karen. We have a few questions coming in. So sort of a simple, straightforward one from Gilles is understanding the link. You were talking about quiet, safe spaces, and you were referring to staff and creating reflection space, but the link between pushing back and the quiet, safe space. And we're talking about the staff experience. Can you sort of link those two together as something to prepare your staff for, or expectations to set?
I think if you have the resources, sometimes that safe space just allows the person time down. But often in larger organizations, there's someone who actually they can go to if they need to talk. And that person usually has some basic training in counseling where it's more active listening. You're not really trying to have an opinion on person's feelings. You're really just there to listen and get them the, I mean, we know this, there's a basic tenement around therapy where they say often it's the things you don't say that do more damage. So you hold it in and then you don't get it out, and then you're carrying in that home and it becomes just toxic and it's harm that it's being done to you. So creating maybe a person or persons who are go-to that something's happened, that person knows if they need a break, they can go to them, and then they can decide, because a lot of this has to be on you charging the team member to ask you for what they need. And we know that it's not a perfect world, doesn't always work out. Sometimes, again, when you don't have the big machine of an HR specialist saying, I know you're saying you don't need this, but I'm telling you it's better for you to go home. I know you say you don't need this, but I'm telling you it's better for you to go and take some quiet time, because I just witnessed someone being verbally assaulting towards you, and that you can't take lightly. So we're assuming from the place of small teams, limited resources, that the person will say if something is happening, and that the offer of that, frankly, from a legal and just operational standpoint, the offering of that as a resource, if someone chooses not to take it up, does protect the organization that you didn't leave someone for harm, because that literally is what happened with the Human Rights Museum. They did not have that as an offer. People were kind of just told, we're the Human Rights Museum. If someone's upset that there's an LGBTQ exhibition and they're assaulting you because their religion is against that verbally, you have to suck it up. No, you don't have to suck it up. You should at least be able to say how you feel, talk through how you feel, especially because we are not charged in museum and heritage world to challenge the person who is being abusive to you, but you still have to protect yourself. So I think it's partly about making sure everyone knows that opportunity is there. And if you don't have a physical space on site, make sure they know that worst case scenario, there is a way to, because it's an emergency, that's the fact, that they're taken care of. It's not that they are seen as less valuable than the patron that came that day with their toxic commentary.
Mhm. It's a great point, and I think a lot of these, a lot of historic places open to the public, so that frontline staff sort of works by sort of a customer service code.
Totally.
And I think we're realizing, especially in the last couple of years, that the customer isn't always right,
No.
and that the general public is not necessarily always meant to be catered to. And so I think it's setting that expectation of safety as well, that
Yeah.
it can be as simple as having that conversation with your staff and saying,
Yeah.
these are the messages we want to stand by as an organization,
Yeah.
and these are the sort of behaviors we won't tolerate from the public, and
Yeah.
this
Totally.
is will be what we do in case
And
of a verbal attack.
completely. And I'll give an example. And this for me was the best example of an organization stand behind. I won't name the organization, but I will name the circumstances where someone literally was picking up tickets for an event, was a high-end patron donor. I think is at the 10,000 or up level. And most organizations, that's the other thing, is people get to be more badly behaved when they're giving you money, in their brains at least. And so this person actually spat on someone. They spit on a volunteer because they felt the volunteer wasn't responding as quickly as they needed to get tickets for something. And of course, the volunteer was devastated. And again, it's queues, lines, and it's like, who are you? You raised by wolves? Who does that? So the organization made the decision to return that person's money and tell them, we are no longer able to service you with what you require for your patronage. Thank you, but no thank you. Peace out. Like, no. So it's literally being able to let the people know that it is safe for them to work for you and that you will not leave them hanging out to dry if they are attacked by a member of the public, and be that someone who's given you lots of money or just a random person who came by that day. It's not okay. And I just think a lot of us have this whole thing, oh, the public will be there, the public gets it. No, they don't all get it, and they're not all there. And that's why our work is super important, because it's about educating the public, but you cannot have the public's education at the detriment of your team.
And that brings me to a question we've had a couple of times is, I think we're sort of talking about change at the organizational level as well. A lot of these are policies that need to be set right at the organizational level when we're talking about policies for safety. And what sort of advice do you have for organizations? I've seen this question a couple of times about if there's difficulties in accepting this work at the board level or at the organizational level, in terms of if the people who are here today in this webinar, they're here for a reason, this is work that needs to be done. What sorts of barriers have you seen or strategies to dealing with possibly with board pushback?
I think there's quite a bit of, and again, when a board is attached to money, it becomes even more difficult, because there sometimes recruitment of board members because of their financial donations. So it becomes even more difficult to divorce or cut ties if you feel the need to. But most organizations that are dealing with things, especially again, larger ones where it's a lot more money, they have phases where you have to make sure at the leadership level, which is your chair and sometimes an executive committee, has bought in and drank the Kool-Aid. And then it's their job, because boards manage boards. It's not the frontline staff's job. Frankly, even the executive job, it's the executive's job to work closely with the chair and the executive leadership to then find the ways to bring people along. And I think a lot of organizations are building in phases where it's like, 3-4 strike levels, where it's like, if we're going to work with you to this point, then after that point, you usually get to a stage where you have to have board terms, and then they just term out, usually in that phasing. And you also end up where you're almost shadowing folks to protect them from a board member who may be abusive or inappropriate. Or they literally have to be asked by the chair to step away because of, frankly, the legal ramifications of something that they might do, either that's inappropriate that the staff's witnessed or the general public. So you just have to go to the point of, if we're going to do this work and you don't have everybody bought in, and like it or not, in the beginning, everyone isn't bought in. I remember being at Heritage Toronto, being hired to do work to diversify and to connect with more diverse communities, because the board was worried that people saw Heritage Toronto as this dusty old thing. And so I walk in, there's a young Black woman in my late 30s, and was excited to do this work. I'm a heritage wonk. I came up with a history degree. This is the lane I wanted to be in. And I remember colleagues who saw me said, what were you doing at this old thing? And then one of the board members in an initial meeting saying, I don't see why we're doing this work because the city wasn't that diverse in the mid-19th century. And so in her brain, the diversity of Toronto is being compared to what diversity looked like then. And there's a disconnect, and she just thought this was useless. And for me, it was, obviously you breathe, and I said, okay, I didn't argue with her. I was a new ED, but I did take it back to the board, and then they stood behind what I was told in the interviews, which was, everyone's not there, Karen. This is work we have to do. This person's on their last term, like, go to your happy place. Obviously, we won't push them to do this work, but there are other people. So I just kept working with the rest of the committee. They kind of bowed out because they weren't interested in the work. So it is difficult, but you need a strategy. And when I say volunteers, and my bad for not clarifying that, I do mean boards, because volunteers, it's everything from frontline volunteers who may be working on programming or covering a front desk to board members are volunteers. And so you have to think about how those bigger team meetings, and frankly, when you're doing something like Historic Places Days, the board should be invited to some of that planning. They should be aware of what's going on, because it's so public and so big that if something goes wrong, it goes wrong big, right? There's more attention on it. So hopefully you at least have a board committee, if it's a large group, that is charged with supporting programming, and would be the ones leading this process. Because as we know, not everybody on the board would necessarily be actively involved in programming, but it does become more difficult when if the leadership at the board isn't there, then you can't do this work. It's just best to peace out, bow out, not. But if the leadership's there, often they will help drive bringing the rest of the team along, and that's really important.
So it's about finding allies as well, right?
Yeah,
it's about
because
a lot of the people in this conversation today I can tell are sort of at the executive level, so they might feel themselves sort of between the board level and what the public is wanting to do and where the programming is at. And so it's also probably about finding the allyship and finding who on the board is an ally, who can you speak to, and sort of what small victories can you start adding up together, which I know is frustrating to our people asking questions or hoping for an easy answer.
There's no easy answer.
No,
that's a sad reality. It's not. It's a lot of work and a lot of patience to get from A to B, and you got to celebrate the small wins. But yeah, it's there's no easy magic bullet.
We have another question, and very specifically, because we did bring up heritage costumes, which I know is a conversation you and I have had a few times. And Alex is asking, he said, you mentioned cultural costuming as being a sensitive topic. They work at a site that has staff dress up in 1860s civilian and military dress, which is not uncommon in heritage places in Canada. Are there strategies to address living history experiences being inclusive and not inflammatory? Part of the experience is to travel back in time to the 1860s physically. So what is your opinion on that? Karen, what sort of advice do you have about that?
I think, as we know, if it's period dress, that was likely a European settler or European military history, that there's a cleaner thread there if it ends up being, frankly, a non-European in the European. As we know, the danger is when it's the opposite, because it's that idea of the dominant narrative still in Canadian cultural history is the European settler notations and ideas. And so that's probably your safest space. What I'm talking about is when people are trying to dress up as a runaway slave or a indigenous fighter, freedom fighter of some kind, warrior, that's where it gets just like, no, don't. Like, that's the easiest thing to say is, and if you want to just make it equal for all, then it's mannequins for everybody, because there is actual discussion, which is what I find fascinating. Often people are in the period dress, in the garb of that era or period or moment, but there's never any discussion about it. And for me, if you're going to do it, then talk about the textiles. Like, then you have to say, okay, what am I doing to actually talk about why I'm wearing this, and functionally, how what I'm wearing from the history of textiles is actually relevant, because people didn't just go buy that stuff at a store. They were made. Like, how did you source the material? What's the connection between what might have been the cotton that someone was wearing and what might have been happening with cotton in the southern United States or somewhere else, or the mills in wherever part of the world the mills would have been happening? I just think it's, don't, even the laziness around the European heritage of cultural dress, period costumes, you miss the opportunity to then open the door to talk about period dress and costuming in really relevant ways. And I feel like a lot of the general public is more interested in this because of the Black Panther, Ruth Carter's work. I feel like a lot of more discussions happening around how films are being made to source accurate costuming for telling, especially racialized and diverse stories. And Ruth Carter is a woman who did the costume design around Black Panther. So when you look at the range of what seems to be different African cultural groups that are represented based on the way they're dressed there, it just opened up this whole other conversation. So I think the general public is smarter than we may think they are around this. So whether it's European or someone else, just if you're going to represent that, and if you even get someone Indigenous who's going to come and wear a particular cultural dress for their community, most of them are not going to come without knowing what they're wearing and why. So create that opportunity to talk about the piece, because otherwise it feels like you're just, it's window dressing. And it for me, it's us as heritage professionals dropping the ball on a particular layer of the storytelling. And there is a story around why we wear what we wear today, much as why we wear what we would have worn then.
Mm-hmm. And it's a great opportunity, especially when we're talking about if you have Indigenous staff coming in to illustrate the Indigenous experience at your historic place, it's a great opportunity to partner and ensure a certain level of accuracy that then you can address. And then if that Indigenous staff member isn't wearing the costume, it's still available to say, in this region, in this area, at this time period, this is what this dress meant, and this is who would have worn it in what circumstances. And it's a great opportunity to expand the storytelling if you're centered in accuracy and partnership as well. So
and if you don't have someone Indigenous, that's why I say things like mannequins, or even putting things on a hanger, and just talk about what was there and why, because it means you've done the work to really represent whether you chose to wear this. Now you could say you knew why. And often that's the issue, is you're wearing something you have absolutely no clue as to why you're wearing it, which is why, frankly, you shouldn't wear it. And if you know the history, that's why you would choose to put it on a mannequin or on a hanger, because it really then gives the person a better sense of exactly what the garment or fabrics or elements of the cultural dress is. It just means you're really adding something to the experience for the visitor instead of just dressing up like it's Halloween.
Exactly.
And it's not Halloween. That's not what we're doing here.
No. No, you heard it here. That's not what we're doing here.
We're not doing Halloween.
Which is great. And I think and heritage costume is something that that comes up a lot. And even in the questions, people are saying, like you said, visitors are smarter than we think they are. And if you're wearing inaccurate costumes as well, even wearing a European costume,
settler, they will know, and they know. And
Emma's making comments saying, oh, should you be wearing a corset? Should you not be wearing a corset? And is that the proper color? And is that the fabric you would be wearing at this site, at this time, in this region, in this climate? So there's
dangers and rabbit holes and landmines either way, whether it's European or somewhere else. So my charge is, if you give the respect to the European, you'll give the respect to everything else. So just give the respect to the history. If you're actually a historic place, then the minute someone steps on your site, you got to be ready to talk about what that means. And that's, be it just, the boundaries of landing on a particular piece of grass, or land, or physically entering a physical space, or virtually entering a space, because, you know, you could be setting up a virtual rendition of something online, but the minute you bring people in, you got to know your stuff, or be honest enough to say, you know, we don't know that. We would love to hear from you in an open source way to get different, to get information that fills out the story and to really feel like it's participatory, or as the Baptist in me likes to have a bit of call and response, which is also, I think, a nice way to engage audiences. It's sometimes fine to just say, you know, we included it, but we're not sure. And we included it because we're hoping to get information from people and to get some ideas that helps us to fill out this story.
Well, thank you, Karen. We've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you again for leading this conversation. This is the first of 3 conversations we're going to be having with Karen about inclusion, diversity, building community, and cultural heritage. And the next 2 webinars will be in the new year. So as registrants of this webinar, you'll be receiving a follow-up email, which will have the link to this recording, as well as an invitation to further events. And this will all sort of culminate in a final resource kit that will be available on our website, fully accessible, both official languages, with some of the printable resources that Karen mentioned earlier as well. And that will be happening earlier in the spring. So I want to thank everyone for coming. We had a great turnout today. I hope this starts a lot of interesting conversations you can bring back to your organizations and your staff. And I want to thank Karen again for joining us. And this was a really illuminating lunch hour.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good rest of the day, folks.
Thanks, Karen.
Bye.